안녕하세요. And good afternoon. Well, Director Clearwater's sort of asked me to explain what I was doing in Korea in the early 1970s. So I guess I'm obligated to take a minute or two and fill you in. Back during the Vietnam War era, I ran out of money, I dropped out of school, and Uncle Sam said, "Come here, boy." And so I had to go in the Army, and for reasons known only to the U.S. Army, they decided to send me to Korea. I was stationed with the U.S. 2nd Division, which in those days was on the front lines, on the demilitarized zone. And I spent a couple of years there by the DMZ in Korea. And I got really fascinated with Korean society and Korean culture, Korean history. And shortly before it was time for me to separate from military service, some of my Korean friends pulled me aside and said, "We think you should go to college in Korea." And I said, "Huh?" And they said yes. And I thought about it, and it did seem like a really interesting idea to me. And so, to make a long story short, I ended up transferring to Korea University in Seoul, where I got my bachelor's degree. Ended up spending a total of 6 years in Korea at that time. After I graduated from Korea University, I came back to the US and I did my master's degree and my PhD degree. And I've been teaching at UCLA since 1989, so I guess that makes 23, 24 years. I consider myself really lucky to be a professor, and particularly to be a professor of Korean studies at UCLA, which is probably the best environment to study Korea of any place outside of Korea itself. We get lots of support from our institution, we have a lot of interest from the community, and we have a large number of faculty, lots of students, so it's a really good place to be, and I'm happy to be where I am. But I'm not here today to talk about myself. I'm here today to talk about Confucianism, society, and ritual in Joseon Dynasty, Korea. I was told to prepare this talk for a general audience, which would include school children, adults, some people very sophisticated in their knowledge of Korea. And so I said, well, okay, how do I do that? And try to make it interesting and meaningful for everybody. I finally decided probably the best thing to do is to sort of pitch it at the level I do for my freshman students at UCLA. They're pretty smart, but they don't know very much. And so I hope that that will work for this audience here today. And I should warn you that Confucianism is a very broad and very complex topic. And so what I have been forced to do here is to be very sort of selective in terms of what I cover, trying to cover the things that I think are most relevant to an understanding of Confucianism and how it impacted society and ritual in the Joseon period. So what I will do first is give you an overview, as I said, a highly selective overview of some of the main tenets of Confucianism and of the historical development of Confucianism. And then I will talk a bit about Confucian social ethics and ritual in the Joseon period. Okay. So what is Confucianism? Well, first thing I would say is that it's clearly not a religion if we're talking about a system of thought that is concerned about deities and afterlife. It's just not interested in those things. Most of us, if we're asked to define Confucianism in a few short words, will say it's a humanist moral philosophy. It's really worried about people, about how people behave, how they think. Got it to work right. I'm going to talk first about early Confucianism. And I think For purposes of our talk today, the two key people that we want to focus on are Confucius himself and Mencius. Confucius lived in the 6th century before current era, and Mencius in the 3rd century, 4th and 3rd century before current era. Confucius and Mencius both lived in an era which saw the demise of the classical order and of considerable strife and warfare. As a result, one of the things that they were really concerned with was how to restore social order, political peace, or as they would have put it, how to restore harmony. And Confucius, and after him Mencius, came up with the answer that the best way to do this is to inculcate ethical thought and ethical behavior. Ethical thought and ethical behavior among human beings was not simply a matter among human beings alone, because for people like Confucius and Mencius, the cosmos, nature, was a moral order. It's not the way we perceive of nature these days as a scientific order that operates by certain mechanical rules which we can understand and manipulate. For Confucius and Mencius, the cosmos was a moral order, and human society was a part of that cosmic order. And so disharmony in human society led to disruptions in the natural order. For example, if you had a series of serious famines or floods, or you had solar eclipses that occurred at unusual times, then this was understood by Confucian thinkers to be evidence from the cosmic order, from heaven, if you will, that something was amiss in human society here on Earth. So, for early Confucian thinkers, it was really important to attain harmony both within human society and between human society and the cosmic order. The role of the ruler, the king or the emperor here, was extremely important. The ruler was expected to be a moral exemplar whose behavior would move the rest of the population, all of his subjects, to follow proper moral behavior and thus to attain harmony. There was also the concept of what is usually translated as the superior man. According to Confucius, the superior man was an educated man, an ethical man, whose function was to advise and assist the ruler in attaining harmony. Ritual fits in here in a very important way. Harmony was not attained simply through the implementation of appropriate policies and other actions. Rather, harmony was also to be attained and maintained through the proper conduct of ritual. Here in the United States, if somebody says ritual, we think, geez, stuffy, boring old ceremonies. And yeah, okay, if you want to think that. But in fact, the notion of ritual or ritual propriety in Confucian order did not extend simply to those kind of ceremonies, but also to your everyday behavior. Everyday behavior was perceived as ritual act. And this is important because the ritual was seen as a reflection of the moral order of the cosmos. And thus, the proper conduct of ritual brings both harmony to society and harmony between human society and the cosmic order. So I think you can see that ritual is considered to be extremely important in I should have flipped over to that a little earlier. Sorry. But anyway, here we are. Another key concern for early Confucians was the question of human nature. The debates on this raged far and wide, but it was Mencius' notion. Remember Mencius over here, the guy on the right? It was Mencius' notion of human nature that ultimately prevailed in the type of Confucianism that dominated in Korea later on. Mencius talked about the four beginnings of human beings. One is humaneness, sometimes translated as benevolence. And this is, I think, a really important concept because if I can get this thing to work, you see the Chinese character there. Of course, many of you know this already, but some of you don't. It's a combination of the character for person, there on the left, and the character for the number 2 there on the right. So run or in is really all about what happens between two people or what happens among people. It's about reciprocity. It's about empathy. It's about taking care of each other. The second one you see there is rightness, sometimes translated as righteousness. Avoiding that which is evil, doing the right thing. The third is ritual propriety, which, according to Mencius, was really learning how to yield to others according to station in life. And the last was wisdom, distinguishing right from wrong. And Mencius said all human beings have this capacity. They are born with the capacity to realize these four beginnings. Whether they do or not depends upon them. The way to cultivate these four beginnings is through education. And so Mencius put a great deal of emphasis on education. Okay. Another important set of concepts that emerged during Mencius' time was this, the 5 moral relations. These are the 5 basic human relations that set a pattern for all. There's a relationship between the ruler and the minister, which is characterized by the virtue of rightness or righteousness. There's the relationship between father and son, which is characterized by affection or love. The relationship between husband and wife, which is characterized by separation or distinction. The relationship between elder and younger, which is characterized by order, by keeping proper place. And then there's a relationship among friends, which is characterized by trust. One of the things that I like to point out to my students at UCLA is that these relations are reciprocal. That is, there should be rightness between the ruler and his minister. The father and the son should love each other. The husband and wife should each respect the other's position. And so these are both reciprocal and to some extent, not totally, but to some extent sort of horizontal relations. But by the time we get to the Han Dynasty, there develops in China something known as Imperial Confucianism. Oops. Something got out of order here? Yeah. Something got out of order, sorry. Anyway, Imperial Confucianism. During the Han Dynasty, Confucianism became the official state ideology with admixtures from legalism and other systems of thought. One of the things that was emphasized during the Han Dynasty were these things, the three bonds, sometimes translated as three standards. It says the minister is bound to the ruler by loyalty. The son is bound to his father by filial piety. And the wife is bound to her husband by faithfulness or chastity, as it's sometimes rendered. Well, these are not reciprocal. These are one-way relationships. The minister must be loyal to the king. The son must be filial to the father. And the wife must be faithful to her husband. Period. End of discussion. And this set of values, the three bonds, then became superimposed on the five relations, the five moral relations that I just talked about. So we end up with a very hierarchical system of values and social order. I remember when I first went to Korea, people didn't talk about Samgang and Oryun, or the three bonds and the five moral relations, as separate entities. It was just one phrase, Samgang Oryun, just lumped together, because the Imperial Confucians and later Confucians had been so successful in superimposing the three bonds on top of the more reciprocal early Confucian five moral relations. Okay, now let's talk about NeoConfucianism. NeoConfucianism was a kind of reform Confucian movement that arose in the Song Dynasty in the 12th century, 11th and 12th centuries. And the one fellow you see there, I guess it's on your left, Jushi, is considered to be the greatest Neo-Confucian thinker of them all, the one who really put everything together and created this comprehensive system of Neo-Confucianism. The guy on the right is Song Shi-il. He's not one of Korea's great Confucian philosophers. We have a number of them. Yi Huang, Yi, many others. The reason why I chose Song Shi-il is because he really fits our theme today, this theme about ritual and social hierarchy. Song Shi-il was one of those Korean Confucianists who was adamant about the proper conduct of ritual as prescribed by Jushi. He wrote ritual handbooks of his own, including one for his daughters called Kenyaso, which is a book warning women. That's the title of it. And so I thought he would be an appropriate representative of Neo-Confucian tradition in Korea for the purposes of today's talk. Okay, so what are some of the features of Neo-Confucianism? Well, earlier Confucianism was not very much interested in the grand metaphysical questions. It focused very much on sort of problems of human relations and governance. But by the Song period, Confucian thinkers began to borrow from Taoism, from Buddhism, these grand philosophical concepts, and they developed Confucianism into a highly metaphysical inquiry into human nature. This school in Korea is most commonly known as the School of Nature and Principle, and the nature there refers to human nature, not the natural order. Another important feature of Neo-Confucianism was self-cultivation. Neo-Confucianism had a prescribed method for self-cultivation, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Begins with the extension of knowledge, and it begins with the investigation of things and the extension of knowledge, and it goes on through a process until you have cultivated yourself and regulated your family, ruled your country, and controlled all under heaven. It was a process by which people were supposed to be able to become Confucian sages. So there was a great deal of emphasis on self-cultivation in NeoConfucianism. And we see in NeoConfucianism a renewed emphasis on the three bonds and the five moral relations. This is true in China, but particularly true in Korea. And there were some other issues in Korea that were pretty complicated. One was, whereas Chinese, of course, were very much interested in the ritual for reasons I've told you. These Korean Neo-Confucian scholars were even more interested in learning about and properly conducting ritual. Because this was now a kind of alien ritual that they were trying to learn. The ritual that came from China was spelled out by Zhu Xi in the Zhijiayi, or the family rituals of Master Chu. And people in Korea were extremely anxious to learn how to do these rituals. And another important issue was that whereas China had been a patrilineal and somewhat patriarchal society for a long, long time, Korea, up until the beginning of the Joseon Dynasty, was a bilateral society. It was not patrilineal, it's not patriarchal. Women in the courtier period in earlier times had quite a bit of freedom, quite a bit of power. And this was not accepted by the by the Neo-Confucian order of things. And so there was a lot of emphasis in Korea in the Joseon period about remaking the Korean kinship group, the Korean family, into along patriarchal lines, patrilineal lines. Here is a photo of a slide of the book I mentioned just a moment ago, The Family Rituals of Master Chu. People in Korea studied this. They went over this. They said, okay, Master Chu says this is the way it should be done, then this is the way we should do it. Not everybody agreed, and we had some real controversies over this. But in the end, Song Xiyao and his followers pretty much prevailed. And the family rituals of Master Chu were implemented, at least among the elites of Korea. And the implementation of this ritual had lots of implications. So, for example, in the courtier period, the time of the previous dynasty, ancestor memorial rituals were shared among all of the children, regardless of gender. Men and women took their turns in conducting and performing these ancestor worship ceremonies. In the Joseon period, however, after the implementation of ritual according to Zhu Xi, women were deprived of their role in the conduct of ancestor memorial ceremonies. And then this in turn was used as an excuse to deprive women of their inheritance. In the courtier period, there had been Chanyo Kyunbun Sansok, which is just a minute, I got to think of the English word for it. Equal inheritance among all children, regardless of gender. But coming to the Joseon period, then the argument was made, since it is men who bear the responsibility for the conduct of these ancestral memorial services, men should get more of the inheritance. And the argument progressed to the point where women were essentially deprived of their inheritance almost completely, and almost everything went to the males. And eventually almost everything went to the oldest son, because the oldest son was the ritual heir. And so I think you can see that the conduct of this ritual is not only important and because of the way in which it represented a means to harmonize human beings and harmonize human society with the cosmos, But it also had other implications about the distribution of wealth, of power, position in society, and other things. Okay. The Joseon state was very anxious to promulgate these Confucian social ethics among the population. And so they produced these morals handbooks. This is one from the 15th century. Actually, it's a somewhat later version of the one that was first published in the 16th century, called the Samgang Hengshilto, or the Illustrated Conduct of the Three Bonds. This particular one happens to be one for faithful women. And if you look at this, you will see that there is Chinese language text here. There is an illustration over here of, in this case, the woman being faithful to her husband. And up above here we have translations into Unmun, or what is now known as Hangul, the Korean phonetic script. You can see by putting in this kind of effort that the Joseon state was very much interested in promulgating these Confucian social ethics among the population, particularly among the elites, but among the population as a whole. And I've already mentioned that women lost much of the power and privilege that they had exercised in the previous dynasty. They were also subjected to something called Samjongjido, or the way of three obediences, or the three followings. This basically said when a woman was young, she followed her or obeyed her father. When she was mature, she obeyed her husband. When she was old, she obeyed her son. So if you take that at face value, then life must have been very grim for women in the Joseon period. The reality is that things don't always work out the way that these moral prescriptions are set up, of course. But also within the Confucian system, women had a certain respected position. First of all, women were expected to fulfill the requirement of nejo, or that is to act as advisors to their husbands. And women were also respected as mothers, particularly after they had produced a son. And a more perhaps extreme example would be that at the court, the king dies and a new king takes the throne who is a child, not an adult. Then somebody has to be regent. In the Joseon period, with maybe only one exception, the regent was the senior palace woman, the Queen Dowager. The Queen Dowager would conduct the business of government by sitting behind a screen and listening to what was going on. And advisors would come back and ask her opinion, and she would write it, and they would take it out and present it. So she was secluded, she was kept separate, but she was exercising power. And there were several instances in the Joseon period when you had queen mothers who acted as regents. So, on the one hand, they were subject to this notion of separation and to the three followings, or the three obediences, and they were secluded. But on the other hand, they had a certain position, a certain role in Joseon society. They were, for which they were respected. Now, let me talk a little bit about Confucian ritual in the Joseon period. Talk first about the three bonds. Here's a 21st century reenactment of court ritual. These guys are bowing before the king in demonstration of their loyalty towards the ruler. And here is something that will be familiar to many of you from Korea. It's still practiced in many households in Korea even today, the ancestral memorial services. And you'll see, well, there's the Shinju, or the spirit tablet, and the male members of the family are gathered around to make their offerings, after which They sit down and enjoy a nice meal. You notice no women are present in this picture. Women could prepare the food, but they couldn't participate in the actual ancestor memorial service itself. I've looked and looked and looked for evidence of some sort of ritual ceremonies for faithful women. Didn't find anything except something that looks like a 21st century creation. What I can tell you is that faithful women, or chaste women, were honored, as were filial sons and loyal ministers, with this, the Hongsanmun, which literally means the red arrow gate. This Hongsanmun would be erected at the entrance to the village, or in some cases at the entrance of the house of the virtuous woman, the faithful woman, or the other exemplars of the three bonds. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about Confucian ritual among the Yangban, the Korean elite. The Yangban, I think, like to regard themselves as superior men. They like to think that their ability to cultivate themselves through their knowledge of the Confucian classics meant that they were definitely superior to the rest of the population. And they thought that their knowledge, their mastery of the Confucian classics entitled them to be advisors to the king. And so the Yangban definitely thought of themselves as, I think most Yangban at any rate, thought of themselves as either superior men or as people who were on their way to becoming superior men. So, ritual was important to the Yangban, and I think you'll see a little bit of it in the exhibit here today. And I came up with this one, which I thought was kind of interesting. I thought you might enjoy seeing. This is the 60th wedding anniversary for a Yangban couple, husband and wife. On the 60th wedding anniversary, and 60th or 59th, depending on how you want to count it, was of course a very important anniversary in the Confucian scheme of things, because the traditional calendar was based on a 60-year cycle. So if you lived to be 60 years old, then you had this grand birthday celebration. And if you'd been married for 60 years, then you had this kind of celebration. At the 60th wedding anniversary, they not only entertained guests in this fashion, but they also renewed their vows. They reenacted the original wedding ceremony. And you could call this a party, maybe, if you wanted to, or a reception. But in fact, the ritual aspects are very strong. You can tell by the way that people are seated, females on one side, males on the other. And here you have a young woman who is before the now 60-year bride, offering her some liquor, some alcohol, in hopes that she will live to be much longer and to be healthy. And the mat is over here for somebody to have done the same for the father. And so this looks like we might think of it as a very party, an informal occasion, but it's not. It's very structured according to the requirements of ritual. Okay. But it's at the court where probably ritual was deemed to be the most important. Here is an late 18th century, second half of the 18th century royal marriage. You have a 60-some-year-old king whose first wife first consort had passed away, and so he got remarried. And so this is a documentary painting of that marriage. And as you can see, of course, everything is laid out very carefully. All of this is done according to ritual prescription. here is something that I believe is part of the exhibit. I was walking around today and I said, oh, yeah. This is an exhibit of the excursion of King Yeongjo in the late 18th century. He was leaving the royal capital in Seoul to go down to a place called Hwasong, near modern-day Suwon. He was actually planning to relocate the capital down to Hwasong. And so this, again, is a very detailed documentary painting of him making this procession down there. And everything, of course, had to be done in the proper ritual fashion. And finally, here's another that I saw you have in your exhibit. And this is the 60th birthday of a Queen Dowager. Took place in the mid-19th century. And it's actually a much, what is it? I think it's 5 or 6 panel, folding panel. I couldn't fit all of it in there, so I just got a couple of the middle panels. But this too, they went through and they meticulously recorded what was going on, how things were set up, and depicted everything as being done according to proper ritual. And so you may wonder, what about the commoners in the Joseon period? To what extent were they bound by this kind of ritual? The answer is not as much as the elites, or certainly as much as the royal family. To give a simple example, in the 15th century, when they were beginning to get very serious about implementing these kind of Confucian rituals, one of the requirements was that upon the death of a parent, a man should go and live for 3 years at the graveside of the deceased parent. And so the debate at court was, well, maybe we can do that. We elites can do that. But if you've got all the peasants over there conducting this 3-year mourning, who's going to grow the rice to feed us and to pay the taxes? And so the debate was resolved by saying, okay, for Yangban elites, it's a 3-year mourning period, but for commoners, it's 3 months. And then back to work, boys. And of course, one of the ways in which the Yangban elites justified their privileged position in society was because they were the ones who had the education and the resources to enable them to learn the Confucian classics and to properly carry out the requirements of Confucian ritual. But as I try to suggest by including this picture of this birthday ceremony for the Queen, there was kind of a place for everybody within the hierarchy and the ritual order of the Joseon Dynasty. Some were more privileged and faced more exacting demands, but in the end, the system sort of had a place for everybody. And in some ways, it must have worked because the Joseon Dynasty lasted for 500 years. Okay, well, thank you for listening to me, and I can entertain questions now if you have any. Yes.
I'll bring the mic over to you.
How is this a factor is reflected in modern-day Korea?
Ah, yes. Well, let's take it very broadly, first of all, okay? At the end of the 19th century, there was a reform movement that arose, which basically said the reason why Korea is having so much difficulty now is because of our slavish commitment to an outmoded philosophy, an outmoded way of life, which was Confucianism. And so there were reformers in the late 19th and the early 20th century who said we need to cast off Confucianism entirely and remake our society along Western lines. Korea was colonized by Japan in 1910. And the Japanese justified their colonization of Korea among other things, claiming that they could modernize Korea. And so while they were there claiming that they were modernizing Korea, at the same time they were also reinforcing certain Confucian values, particularly the kinds of things that we talked about with the three bonds, for their obvious political utility, right? Loyalty to the emperor, filial piety from the son to the father, faithfulness of the wife to the husband. All of this is a very good way to establish some sort of authoritarian moral order, social order. Korea was liberated in 1945, and a lot of the leading intellectuals of Korea at that time said, we got to get away from this Confucian stuff. But the reality is that there were lots of other Koreans, particularly rural elites, who still clung very strongly to Confucian values. And so Confucianism remained a potent force in Korean society, not so much as a philosophy, but rather as a set of social values. In the early 1960s, Park Chung-hee carried out a coup d'etat, took over the government, and he wrote a series of books basically in which he blamed Confucianism for many of the ills that affected Korea. So throughout the 1960s, he came across as being mostly anti-Confucian. Then you get into the 1970s when he has amended the Constitution to make himself president for life, and suddenly he decides that Confucian values are okay after all. And he launches this new mind, or Seimao-Mundong, which was headed by his daughter, who is the current president of the Republic of Korea. And she went around the country giving talks about the importance of filial piety and other Confucian values. And then there was an incident in the 1990s, early 1990s, I think it was, a particularly gruesome incident called the Chijeonpa incident, where some alienated young men decided that they were going to just kill people who had money, who had nice cars, and went to department stores and that kind of stuff. And so a reaction to that in some quarters was to say that, oops, we're facing real moral depravity in our society now. We need to go back to Confucianism to fix this. And so, for example, the president of my alma mater at that time decided that he was going to require all students at my university to take a course in a 14th century Confucian morals primer and have them all live in dormitories where they would be under the supervision of faculty who would instill in them these Confucian values. So there's been this constant effort to try to sort of maintain Confucianism in Confucian values in Korean society. The problem is that the Confucian system of values may work for a pre-modern agrarian society. It does not really work for a modern urban industrial society. And so Confucian values in Korea have been weakening steadily over the last 20 or 30 years. One of the areas where the change has been most dramatic has been in the question of the status of women. If you looked at family law in Korea back 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, everything went to the man and nothing went to the woman, simply put. The best way to illustrate this is to say in the case of divorce, in almost all cases of divorce, the women lost custody of the children. The women were chased out of the house, of course, and the women did not receive alimony. So they got nothing. They were complete losers in instances of divorce. They had a household head law, Hojupop, which said that everybody in a household had to be registered under the name of the household head, and the household head was, of course, the senior male in the family. And also, the law in Korea functioned in such a ways so that there were many important things you could not do without the permission of your household head. Marriage, for example. You could not be entered as married into the household register without the tojang, the stamp, the seal of the household's head. So these kind of things really worked against women, and they were always justified in terms of Confucian tradition. Now those things are past history. Family law has been greatly modified to enhance the position of women, and the household head law has been abolished. And so now women are, I would not depict South Korea as a paradise for women, but I would say that status for women has improved dramatically over the last 20 years in ways that we just couldn't imagine 30 or 40 years ago. I hope that answers your question.
Another question? Oh, Jay. Oh, Jay, then, well, okay.
Could you say a few words how Confucian philosophy or thought expresses itself in current China?
That's a tough one. I mean, we know that the leadership of the People's Republic of China has been emphasizing Confucianism a great deal in recent years as it seeks to find, to sort of reconstruct a Chinese identity. And I'm not that familiar with what's going on in Chinese society and culture right now to be able to address this question at any length. But one of the things that I do see from my vantage point as somebody who's interested in Korea is that the Chinese leadership and Chinese intellectuals seem to be trying to revive the old sort of Confucian-style tributary relations as a model for a future China-centered order in East Asia. So I can see that. To what extent do I think that the Chinese leadership will be successful in sort of reimplanting Confucian values in contemporary China? I think it's got to be difficult. It's got to be difficult. I mean, for the same kinds of reasons that we have in Korea. The rapid urbanization, industrialization, commercialization of society makes it really hard to maintain those old values. If I can, again, fall back on the Korean case, which may not be applicable to the Chinese case. Back during my student days, it was automatically assumed that the eldest son would live with his parents after marriage and who would take care of them until they passed on. And this was considered to be real filial piety. Nowadays, that rarely happens. Why is that true? There are probably a number of factors. One of the biggest factors has to do with the marriage market. Back in the 1960s, women were willing to marry the eldest son because the eldest son was going to get the bulk of the inheritance, and they thought maybe in the long term they would be better off. By the 1980s, women are saying, me, marry the eldest son and spend the rest of my life taking care of his parents? You got to be kidding me. So it became more difficult for eldest sons to find a suitable, a desirable match on the marriage market. So then parents started saying, well, no, we don't expect you to live with us. We're going to live on our own. You don't have to live with us after you get married. And so now the norm in South Korea is for eldest sons to not live with their parents. And parents do tend to live on their own for as long as they can. And it's been my observation, and it's also what I've heard from many of my friends in Korea, that nowadays it's really the daughters who step up and take care of the parents when they get into their old age. And so these kinds of social changes that are driven by urbanization, by capitalism, I think make it very difficult to recreate a Confucian moral order in the 21st century.
I think we have time for one more question. Jay, do you? Oh, yes.
Beyond the ritual and tradition, how is the spiritual side of Confucians like returning to the original, lived out?
Okay. Is there a real spiritual side to Confucianism? There is. I mean, I started off by saying I would not describe Confucianism in the conventional sense of a system of thought that is concerned about deities and afterlife, and the afterlife, and I stand by that statement. But there is, of course, in this whole process of self-cultivation, a very important place for what they call gyam, which can be translated as abiding in reverence. It's really a kind of meditation. It's a process of meditation you go through. Once you have, examined things, extended your knowledge, and made your will sincere, and all of those kinds of things. That's a key part of Confucian self-cultivation. And so there's obviously some sort of a spiritual aspect to that. In addition, you can find in ancestor memorial rituals certain aspects of spirituality. How to explain this? Well, to make it simple, NeoConfucian thinkers believed that after a person died, the person had two types of spirits. One was a spirit that hung around here on the earth for a while, and the other was a spirit that went back to heaven, to the cosmic order, right? And there was a belief that the kind of spirit that hung around here on earth had the ability to affect the fortunes of his or her descendants. And so that was one of the reasons why this ancestor worship ceremony was considered to be so important. And there are other issues such as the location of graves, following geomantic principles, which are not necessarily Confucian, but definitely an integral part of the overall East Asian civilization sphere. So there are, I think, spiritual aspects to it.
Thank you, Professor Duncan. Please join me in thanking.
My pleasure.